goes out of the house and he sat by the lake, which I wonder if he started teaching then. So maybe he's sitting by the lake teaching, maybe he's just sitting by the lake by himself, maybe he's sitting by the lake with his disciples, I'm not really sure. But then large crowds gathered around him. There were so many people, he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. So I want you to just envision kind of what is happening in the scene. Jesus is sitting, and sitting was the posture that a Jewish teacher would take when teaching their disciples. So that was a position of authority, to sit and teach. But Jesus is sitting on a boat, so he's a little bit further out, and all the people are on the shore or on the beach listening to him. And so in that context, that's where this parable picks up. Okay, who would like to read maybe through verse 15?
Okay. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seeds fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Through seeing, they do not see. Through hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn. I would heal them.
So I really wrestled with whether to include kind of this middle section, but I think it is really important to understanding this parable. And I think that context is important to include. Okay, who wants to pick up in verse 16 and just read through the end?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly, I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Listen then to what the parable of the sowers means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word and making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown.
Thank you. So there are so many different ways to read and hear this parable. So when you hear it today, what stands out to you and what resonates with you?
I'm sorry, go ahead. This is hard for me because I see it and sorry.
You're good.
Someone who's been in the church all their life, you would think are fully rooted. But when trouble comes, they turn away from God. They anger at what has happened to them. This is specifically about someone whose son was murdered. And they could not turn to God, that anger and that hate and that seeking revenge, wanting revenge, but not seeking it. Wanting bad things to happen to the person who did this. And it's heartbreaking. It really is heartbreaking. And what do you say?
Yeah, so many things can come in. We see that in all these different ways. You know, there can be, it didn't sink in a whole lot, or distractions, or lots of things, or hard things, sufferings.
Yeah.
All of those things can pull us away. Yeah. And
So I've always thought that the parables were put in for people to understand better. And that's something that in this series has been a surprise in some ways, that it's not really put in for the common people to understand.
yeah.
And it's put for as David has said, and you said, to go deeper into it, to learn and understand and delve in it. But that has been a surprise in my head.
Yeah.
And so the ever hearing, not understanding it's been something to work through.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost to find the people, by telling a parable like this, you find the people who get it. Because they do want to stick with it, and they do want to go deeper. Yeah. In that section, the very first thing I thought about was my kids when I say, put your shoes on. They hear me. I know they hear, though their ears have heard what I said, but there's not a lot of perceiving going on in that moment until maybe the 5th or 6th time.
That's right.
But I also think sometimes that's where I am too, where I have to hear things multiple times, and maybe in different ways, or maybe in a different season of my life, or through a different person, right? And so I think even though I have heard sermons upon sermons on this parable, I feel like every time I read it, I'm in a different season, I'm in a different place, and so there's different things that resonate with me, and that I hear differently that I could not have heard before.
Well, that's right, you weren't ready to hear.
Right.
How often have we heard people discuss a particular scripture we've read many times, only to say, I've never considered it from that perspective
Right.
before. We learn something every time.
And we learn from each other,
Yeah.
which is why discussing it with other people is so rich. Yeah.
And sometimes you do have to have it repeated. When the kids were growing up, we had a bird, a parrot, that sounded just like me. And in the morning, I'd get my kids up, and Amy would get up fine. I'd say, Mikey, get up. Mikey, get up. Mikey, get up right now. Well,
Maybe
then
I need a
the
parrot.
would
Maybe that's what
start.
I need. I need a
And she'd
bird.
say it. I said, okay, Mama, I heard you. I said, that wasn't me.
Yeah. Oh, that's so funny. I also thought it was interesting. So this is the first time I think I had read through in verse 17 that there were people in the past that longed to hear these things, that longed to see these things. It's not that they weren't ready, it's that the timing wasn't ready. And so sometimes maybe the timing is right, but we're not in a play. We find ourselves in one of these places. And sometimes we are ready, but it's not the time in history for us to hear that, or the time in our life for us to hear that. That stood out to me this time. What else stood out to you as you thought about this story?
When I've traditionally read this story, I've always imagined myself to be like one of these variants of soil. I think sometimes it's helpful to say, oh, well, maybe we are supposed to be a different role in the story. And then, so it's almost like, it'd be good if you would read these and like, go, oh, who do I traditionally imagine myself to be, and then read it again and play it in another role.
That's right.
And because I think it could really open up
Yeah.
like another meaning. If you're the sower, then it's like different.
That's right. I think I think all of those meanings are here.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, this was told by Jesus to a particular audience. This was intentionally included by Matthew in his writing for the community that he was around. And then we are reading it in our context, and the Spirit, you know, brings those words along to us. And I think there's all these different levels. You know, I think that matters. And so it is a good practice to first, I think it's helpful to first notice where you just naturally put yourself in this story. Like where do I just first assume that I am? Because that tells you a little bit about yourself. And then intentionally moving yourself around in the story and reading through it again. If my first thought is, oh, which soil am I, or which, you know, then that's great. You can read through that and kind of reflect on that, but then read it again on purpose, putting yourself in the position of the sower. Or what happens if I'm just a bystander and I'm watching both of these groups? What does that mean for me, and what's my invitation? You know, in those circumstances.
And we have to work to keep our hearts from becoming calloused,
Yeah,
because it's so easy to do in the living world.
absolutely.
What makes it harder for us to understand is because written to them, they were looking for the Messiah. That was the whole thing. The bad Jews, the good Jews, all of them. They were looking for the Messiah, so they never saw kingdom the way we have been taught, like that's heaven.
Right.
They saw it as the Messiah that God chose to sit on the throne of David. That's what they were waiting on. So the word of the kingdom is what was being sown. And they were, bless you. And so they were looking for a king, but the king was talking to them right then. That was the whole rub of the thing, that if you understand, you will see me as the Messiah. And that, you know, that was the big lead up. And for us, we're looking back, and we already know it's Jesus. We already know he's on the throne. We already know he died and was buried and resurrected. So how that applies to us and what we learn from it is kind of like the example that was you familiar? That you said about see, people have a hard time who don't really understand and have roots. How is God ruling that he let that happen? And that's how people feel. In real time, people don't, sitting in classrooms and sitting in churches listening to sermons don't do you any good if what your faith is not real. If it's just, oh, I did my duty, I didn't miss church today. And I did, you know, that's not good. That won't help. The fact that you know God ruling, and no matter what happened, we can all lose a child. We can all lose somebody close to us. But if our first thinking is, okay, God is in control, I'm gonna hit my knees and I'm gonna look for him to get me through this. Church not gonna get me through this. Bible class not gonna get through me. The one that's ruling, that God sat on that throne, the throne of my heart, to get me to reason that, hey, he saves me from everything. He saves me from sin. He saves me from killers. You know, if you're not thinking like that, and if that's not your root, you're gonna struggle, and the struggle gonna need to keep coming. That's the bad thing about it. You won't never get rid of that particular struggle till God primes you and send you through the fire. So what comes out will be genuine.
Right. Yeah.
This kind of reminds me of the quote that you shared at the very beginning of class, where it talks about how he was trying to illuminate the fact that we have a choice, like the importance of this choice we have to follow him to begin with, but to continue choosing him over and over. And what you said, I keep going back to in verse 15, where it says, you know, their hearts have been calloused, they hardly hear, they close their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their hearts, or hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, and in turn, I would heal them. You know, and so it's not about like us trying to force it. It's about making the choice to hear and listen, and then God will heal us. So it's like a humility, rather than thinking like we have to be better. We have to choose to forgive. We have to be okay with the really terrible things that happen
Mhm. Yes.
in life that we have no control over. Well, no, you don't. Actually, you can just choose to humble your heart to whatever God is saying, and then He will heal that in you.
And yeah, and maybe it's about God healing me,
Right.
where I really want to say, well, God, go fix that person, go fix that situation.
Right.
But when my prayer really needs to be, heal what's calloused in me, and calluses take a long time to build up, right? That's not like an overnight, thing, or that's not just one thing that happens to you, but those are practices that over time make your heart hard, or make those things really challenging for God to be able to speak to you, for you to be able to hear what God is saying. And maybe that's our first prayer, is that God will soften those things in us and heal those things in us.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me get Marty and then Catherine.
There's a couple of things that I think about on this is, one is, it kind of, when you talk about having ears and not hearing and eyes that don't see, it kind of reminds you of the Old Testament prophets who, I think Isaiah made that statement. And a lot of times they were prophesying things that the people did not want to hear, and so they just refused to listen and refused to hear. But there were repercussions for not doing that. And I kind of think Jesus is doing sort of the same thing here. He's giving this message, the people are ignoring it, and so maybe the illusion is that bad things are about to happen because you're not listening and you're not seeing.
Yeah, 'cause you're not hearing now.
Yeah.
That's not going to bode well for the future.
So I think he's kind of tying it back to a phrase that they would be familiar with from the Old Testament. It wasn't the Old Testament then, but from what they had been taught all their lives, through the teaching of the prophets. So I'm thinking it might resonate with them a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
And also think about the apostles, what kind of soil they were.
Yeah.
When they were called, Jesus just called them and they dropped what they were doing and followed him. So I'm kind of thinking that would be kind of the rich soil.
Yeah.
And you can kind of figure out as you go through and look at all the people that Jesus encountered in his ministry, and look at the soils that are there, and I think they all fall into those categories.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great comment. Catherine.
And so often you hear people say, this person was a good person, how could God let that happen to them? And every time I hear that, it makes me wonder how much they know about God. Do they really know God? Because the Bible tells us we are not exempt from anything. And I'm a good person, I'm a Christian, that shouldn't happen to me. It's really difficult to understand sometimes. And I guess the pain and suffering overcomes and maybe temporarily makes us callous. And
That's a great point. Yeah, so sometimes that suffering and the things that we encounter. Last week we talked a lot about kind of evil in the world, and what do you do when evil feels overwhelming. So if you weren't here and that is interesting to you, go listen to it. But that same kind of thing, the suffering that which we will all experience. None of us is immune to it. So the suffering that we experience, the distractions, the hard things, it's a part of being human. We don't get to escape it, no matter where we find ourselves with God, right?
God also told us none of us are good.
Yeah.
There's none
Yeah.
good except one.
Yeah. What is encouraging to you in this story as you read through it?
Hope.
There's hope.
Some plants do eventually grow.
Yeah.
And you have to think about it like even farming is something you learn as you go through it.
Right.
So a beginner farmer is going to throw it in the soil that doesn't necessarily return your investment, but
Yeah.
you learn from that
Yeah.
and you move forward and you understand, oh, if I'm planted here, I'm going to wither and die. Or, oh, if I'm planted here, you learn through life, you learn through experience, and there's hope.
Yeah, it's a learning process as we live our lives, right? Yeah. And even in those, less optimal soils, things were growing. Things were growing. It wasn't completely hopeless, right?
I'm reminded of a time when I was, a long time ago, when I was about 4 or 5, my dad was in the Air Force. He was stationed up in East Bay, Labrador, or something on the old D line, protecting us from the Soviets. But we spent a summer with his sister, my Aunt Ethel, and her husband, Uncle Lou. And he was a farmer in Virginia. And one day he was plowing, and I went behind his tractor, not plowing, he was planting. He had a little thing that was dropping the seeds every so far. I followed him, and he's got like a 20-acre farm here. I followed him and was covering the seeds. Of course, it took me a long time, but he stopped and he said, "What in the world are you doing?" I said, "Well, you got to cover the seeds or they won't grow." He said, "Yeah, they will." And I said, "No, they won't." So that day, as he came in, at the end of the day, he had plowed a little portion of ground about 1/4 the size of this room, maybe 10 feet, and not even the length. And he said, "Now, I'm going to get some seeds, and I'm just going to throw them over there. Now, over here on this part, I want you to get your little, hold your little stick and cover them up, and a couple of weeks from now, we'll see." Well, doggone it. There were plants growing all over that place. Yes,
Right.
mine, and yes, his too. So there's nothing, what did Mark Twain say, there's nothing more annoying than the annoyance of a good example.
That's right, yeah.
But it's gonna grow no matter what you do, but
Yeah.
it's what results happen.
I love that. You have a lot of hope in that story too, right? Yeah. What is convicting to you in this story? I think we get both. We get encouragement from this story, and then there's some conviction and things we're invited into. You don't have to get super personal.
I think that it's,
We all,
oh,
we all lack understanding sometimes.
We all lack understanding, that's right. Yeah.
I'll be those soils. Every one of us can be in each of those soils, it's,
Yeah, and are.
yep,
We are
yep.
often each one of those at different times. Yeah.
Well, I kind of keep going back to the 2-question thing, where the one question is, okay, I hear it, but the 2 question is, I understand it. And so it's, like, you have to not just hear it, you have to understand it.
Yes.
And that's hard to do sometimes. 'Cause
Right.
Sometimes it's like, okay, yes, I heard you put my shoes on.
Yeah.
But now I need to understand putting my shoes on.
Yes.
And,
There's going to be consequences if I don't put my shoes on.
and that's,
Right.
that's part of that is that
Yeah.
you can hear it, but you need to understand it.
Yes.
And understanding may cause suffering
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, that's hard.
But, and two, a lot of times, because we didn't get understanding, we forget.
Right.
See, your children forgot.
Right.
And I would, the way I forget, I definitely could relate to that. But it's not, if we don't, kind of like James said, if you're not a hearer and doer, because you wait too late to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
While you right there in front of the word, instead of letting it
Right.
engraft itself in your psyche and your way of thinking and your way of reasoning, you say, "Oh, I'll do that when I run across it," and then you forget. You say nobody does a mirror that way. You don't go in the mirror and see where you need to fix something and say, "Okay, I'm gonna walk away and try to remember and then fix my hair, my face, or whatever."
Yeah, if my kids are an adult and they forget to put their shoes on every day, that's going to be a problem for them, right? At some point, they do need to understand the whole why behind this is a thing that we do. This is a thing we need to cultivate, right?
Why
Practice.
do it as soon as you understand?
Uh-huh,
As soon as
right.
you get it, instead of, "Okay, I'll
There
put
is a
those
why.
shoes on later,"
Right.
5 times later.
Right. So there were a few, there's so many different themes you could pull out of this. But there were a few that stood out to me. So these are just the ones that stood out to me. These are not, all 3 of them ever. The first one that stood out to me was this theme of identity and fruit and what is your life producing. So as we talked about, Jesus tells this story, but Matthew also tells this story. And I think that it might have been very important, especially for the early church, to be able to recognize really what Catherine was talking about. There's a difference in going to church or going to a church or even being part of a community, and then my life is ruled by Christ. And how to know the difference in yourself and sometimes in other people. You have to be careful, I know with that, but even in our own communities, like not in a judgment way, but also in a discerning way. Recognizing where maybe we have veered off path. And I think, so this is, I kind of just marked out. So here's the 4 where the seeds fell when they were scattered, and then what happened to each one of them, which is what we just read. But this looks at first glance, looks like a dividing parable to me. Like when I first read it, it's like dividing all of these people. And that is true. But why? But why is it talking about dividing people? And I think it's important for us to be able to recognize, where are we falling in here? And if we are, there is a difference in I go to church 3 times a week. Okay, what happens when suffering comes? Just like what you guys are talking about. It's a clarifying parable. And for the early church especially, this was a brand new faith. This was not, there's churches everywhere all over the world. And so I think it becomes especially important to ask the question, what is true? What are we professing to be true? And to protect that. And that's true for us too. But the clarifying piece of this is, what is being produced in your life? Because only one of these is actually producing something, is actually producing fruit. You can read through the fruits of the Spirit. What in my life is producing love and joy and peace? Recognizing even like, who might we follow who's telling us things? What is being produced in that person's life? Can I see the fruit of the Holy Spirit in that person's life? Because anyone can say good words, but what is their life producing? What is the harvest looking like for them? And that's more than how many people are they baptizing, right? Which is a lot of times how I grew up, kind of the numbers game of, well, this is how many people have been converted by this person. But I think there's things that matter deeply that maybe that ignores too. Like, that's important, but also, what kind of life is that person living? What kind of life am I living? So I think this is a really clarifying parable. The second theme, I didn't read this quote. Let's see if it's important. Okay. Christians too, this is from Douglas Hare. Christians too needed to be warned not to regard their status as church members as a guarantee of future salvation. There were many who appeared to see and hear, whose behavior betrayed the fact that they had not really understood. And that's the difference in hearing and understanding, right? But you can see that through what your life is producing. I think if you forget about that piece, you can get stuck in the anxiety of, am I really understanding? Am I not understanding? Well, there's a way to know. You look at what your life is producing. Okay, the second theme is loss. I found this so interesting, and I had not really thought about it before. So in reading this parable, you can reframe the reading of it instead of space to time. So instead of, well, you put seed over here with these people or this person or here, these different groups of people, you can read it as, what if this is one life? If I am the sower, this is one life. I am trying one thing after another and nothing seems to be working. This is a quote from Thomas Long, this book, Proclaiming the Parables. This is a story of loss, and repeated failure is indeed a key reality to experience in this parable. The farmer sows and the seed is lost, sows again and loses again, and sows a third time only to receive a yield of nothing. This is a parable about the places where one worries about everything, where life has been trampled down, where hope has been ground into dust, where the seed has yielded nothing time and again, and nothing more is expected. This is a parable about the situation of utter hopelessness into which an abundant harvest arrives as a complete surprise, a moment of astonishment. I loved this perspective because we live in a world of difficult soil. And when you look at fairy tales, and a lot of the parables in the Bible, these stories use this pattern of 3, right? It's like 3rd time's the charm. There's a reason that we say that, because stories do. The first one doesn't work, the second one doesn't work, but the 3rd one does every single time, but not in this parable, because the 3rd one doesn't work either. And when the 3rd one doesn't work, at that point, we find ourselves in a place of hopelessness. And I think a lot of us have been there. When you get to that place, you've done all the things. But in this parable, God shows up. And then there is this abundant harvest that no one expected, where it is a harvest of surprise. And that resonated with me a lot, because this is a picture a lot of times of ministry. This is a picture of Jesus's ministry. This is a picture of what the early church may have been experiencing as a new baby faith. And I think all of us will find ourselves in times where that feels like our reality, and we've tried time and time again to come out on top, and we're not. So this is one of the things that gave me encouragement in reading this parable. I also thought, when you do that, when you go through kind of these multiple losses and failures, it can kind of jade you into thinking, well, I don't think I'm going to scatter seed there anymore, because I don't think it's going to do any good, because I've tried that. And so it led me to this question: how many times have I not scattered seeds because I've already determined that it would not work? There's some wise discernment that matters, but also, if I truly trust that God can take that and turn it into an abundant harvest, that's convicting to me. And I thought about that image of, like we talked about last week with the weeds and the wheat, the sun shining down and the rain falling on the righteous and the unrighteous. And if it's my responsibility at times to be able to give those good things, like, who am I to hold back joy and peace and grace and mercy from somebody because I have already predetermined that they're in one of these categories? But that is really hard. That's really hard. This is a great quote by Paul Tillich. He did this sermon called Holy Waste. He says, "The history of humankind is the history of men and women who wasted themselves and were not afraid to do so. They did not fear the waste of themselves, of other people, of things in the service of a new creation. They were justified, for they wasted all this out of the fullness of their hearts. They wasted as God does in nature and history, in creation and salvation." And I just thought about the extravagance of God in just pouring out grace and mercy that none of us deserved. What are your thoughts as you hear some of these things? Do they resonate with you? You have other things they're making you think about. How do they land with you?
I'm astonished by the fact that there have been times when I thought I was so grounded in the faith, and I expressed my perspective, only to realize later that well, what planet are you from? That's not how we think. I've been trying for 20 years to stop going to church. Now, of course, the caveat is we don't go to church. We are the church. We go to worship, we go to fellowship, we go to Bible study, but we don't go to church. And I've said this before, but somebody once told me, said, "Bob, it's just semantics." But I don't know if I can convince myself that church is someplace to which I go on occasion. And I can also convince myself that if I'm not there, I don't need to be on my best behavior. Well, when are we ever not there? When are we ever not part of the church? We're always part of the church, no matter where we are, who we're with, what we're doing, or why. We're always the church. So I'm trying to tell people, never go to church again. There's you understand.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, other thoughts? You can say you don't like it too, if you disagree.
I think it's not for us to say what's considered a waste.
Yeah.
And what's considered bad soil, because you could have fields that have historically produced a lot of fruit, but because you've overworked them, they're deficient in nutrients, and that's now bad soil.
Yeah.
So you have to leave it alone.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that a farmer is not going to still plant something. They're just gonna leave that specific section of field alone. And let it
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, things that maybe have worked in the past stop working, and we don't know who to blame.
I think if we could get to the point where we don't consider the soil at all, we just do, it would be a good thing for us.
Yeah, there is something very American in us that wants to say, where is the best return on investment? And what if we stop considering the soil at all?
And on occasion, that seed over there, which isn't supposed to grow, on occasion, it catches root, and it does produce. I mean, how many places have we seen, especially in our yards, that weed's not supposed to grow there? Well,
It's in the
sometimes-
middle of the pavement, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
a crack in the middle of the
On the
pavement.
side of
because it-
that overpass,
Yeah.
they're growing out of the seams there.
Yeah.
You don't worry about, you just cast the net, okay? But obviously, cast the net where you think it'll be
Yeah.
accepted, but cast the net, it's not our job to decide, well, I'm not gonna extend the gospel to him, because, no, that's not our project.
Yeah, because God didn't do that with me.
Yeah.
You know, because that was God's posture towards me was, I'm gonna keep trying. Right? Yeah.
Because it talks about judging, so, and we reminded that the Lord said, who are you to judge another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he is able to make him stand.
So there was an image as I thought about seeds, and I thought about farming, which will come as a surprise. I don't have a whole lot of experience with farming, but I thought about. But the image that I have in my head when I think of this parable is, this person throwing seeds, or maybe the way I do it is like, I think it will grow there, like a little bit more. But each of those seeds is very intentionally falling where you put it. And so there is another image that for me was helpful in thinking about this. If it's helpful for you, take it. If it is not, leave it. But I thought about dandelion seeds. And I thought, what if I think of sowing seeds more like this, where my job is not at all to decide. I could blow them this way, and they'll end up over here, because I'm very much not in control of where the wind takes them. And they just will land where they land. And maybe my job is not to, like you said, not think about the soil at all. When my kids do this, they're not thinking of, well, how many dandelions do I think are gonna grow if I stand here versus how many flowers will, you can't do that.
And with that, think of the sheer joy that as a kid, blowing that. What if we can do that with? And
Yeah,
again,
because
it's
what if
not in
this
our
gives us
control.
joy,
Yeah.
regardless of the outcome? Maybe that part isn't up to us. That's a crazy thought. Yeah. What are your thoughts? All right, so theme 3, which we kind of did talk about a little bit. Theme 3 is our own hearts. So kind of like what Catherine was talking about, if our prayer is for God to turn and heal us where we are calloused, we always have to be looking inward with all of these parables. It's so easy to read a parable like this and think, well, I'm going to assign to all the people that I know what kind of soil I think they are. Don't do that. We always have to be looking inward. We always have to be, bringing in that introspection and allowing God to read us through a parable like this. And there's a danger in assigning a soil type to people, but I would also say there is a danger in assigning a soil type to yourself. Because we can get so caught up in, this is the kind of soil that I am, when in reality, we've been all of them, we will be all of them, and right now, there are parts of all of them in us now. There's parts of my heart that are distracted, and there's parts of my heart that are hardened, and there's parts of my heart that are really open to God. But I think that's a more honest view of ourselves. I think if we label even ourselves as one of the four, it can hold us back. Especially if we think we're good soil. No one is 100% good soil. And so, I may forget what are the things that I need to be working on? What are the rocks that I need to get out of my life? Or what are the thorns that I need to pull up? There's this quote by Elizabeth Johnson. She's a Minnesota pastor. She said, if there's any hope for the unproductive soil, it is that the sower keeps sowing generously, extravagantly, even in the least promising places. Jesus' investment in his disciples shows that he simply will not give up on them, in spite of their many failings. And we trust that he will not give up on us either, but will keep working on whatever is hardened, rocky, or thorny within and among us. We trust in his promise to be with us to the end of the age. I love that quote because I thought about Jesus with the disciples. Like someone else mentioned, they must, and I think there are parts of them that absolutely were ready to receive Jesus and that were this good soil. And then all throughout the scripture, we also see those other parts of them that are resistant or that are tempted by other things or that, try to steer the ship another way. And can I trust in the King of this kingdom that he is working on those things? In me and in other people and in our churches and in our world, can I trust that? So we'll leave you with the practical piece. The question to kind of reflect on this week: what parts of my heart resist hearing what I need to hear from God? And then specifically, you can sit with which parts of my heart are hardened, which parts or calloused is a great word for that. Like if you want to reframe that a little bit, which parts of my heart, maybe this is a parable I've heard 100 times. I can't hear anything more from it, So which parts are hardened? Which parts of my heart are distracted? What are the distractions in my life that are keeping me from being able to hear the things that I need to receive from God? Which parts of my heart feel wounded? When I thought about the thorns, there's parts of us that are wounded, and that sometimes keeps us from being able to receive what God has for us. And those questions, that's about the suffering that you talked about. God, that is hard. That might be the hardest one, I think, actually, to work through the wounds that we have. Because those are a lot of times legitimate wounds, legitimate suffering. But how do we work through that to be able to receive the things God has for us? And then our prayer going forward from that, praying that God will give us understanding, that I may keep thy law and observe it with my whole heart, with all of these parts.
I know you're trying to close, but so many of us had such absolutely profound messages from Allison Smith, our sister who died recently, suffering with this cancer, many kinds and all that, and she kept saying, I'm blessed. And so many of us were just amazed that she would say, I'm blessed, after that she was suffering. It was a real time thing that we learned lessons from that girl.
Yeah, and you have seen this in people's lives who have suffered well. I've seen that. I've seen people who have really struggled with it, and I've seen people who have suffered really, really well. And I think the depth of your roots does make a difference when those times come. Right? Yeah.
I think a lot of times we make the mistake, like we see these 3 things, we think we can fix those.
Uh-huh,
And that's the problem.
yeah,
You know, God has to fix all of that. We just need to recognize it in ourselves and then know that, okay, God, you know I'm weak. You know I wouldn't be here if I was anything, so
Yes.
I need you to,
which I think the
Soften
prayer part
that.
is so important,
you know,
because we could just
soften.
do the first part and go, okay, here's my checklist, here's the things I need to work on and change,
Yeah,
but if you don't have this part.
we want to change. We think we can work on it. And if we wounded, God have to heal us. If we don't come to, if we have resentment because we're wounded, we're not going to go to God.
That's right.
And that's the problem. So,
That's right.
you know, that can.
You have to dialogue
That's
with
real.
God.
All of that's real. And
That's
I've seen it. I've talked to hundreds of people.
Yeah.
And it's-
That's right.
It's allowing God to do
Yeah.
what he alone can do.
What you believe.
We've got like 3 minutes if anyone has any burning thoughts that they need to share. All right, I'm gonna pray for you. God, thank you for the gift of Scripture and the gift of being together and being able to dig into these things. They're hard. But the gift that it is and the blessing that it is to hear from each other and think about things in new ways and turn things over in our minds and just explore all kinds of things in our lives together. And I thank you for the community you've given us at BML, and I pray that our worship today will be uplifting to you and that you will be with us through the rest of this week. In the name of Jesus. Amen. And we do have class next week. So that's our last, next week is Soul Link weekend, but it's our last class. We're gonna go ahead and have class at 9. I think we have the past couple of years. So we'll be back in here and that'll be our last class.